what is the cerebrospinal fluid? What is its role? Where does it flow? Why do we have it at all? So, these are a lot of questions. Yes, cerebrospinal fluid is a fluid, obviously. So, it's some fluid that is flowing in the central nervous system. So, why do we have fluid in the central nervous system? Generally speaking, cerebrospinal fluid has a lot of functions of the blood. For example, it will be place for living of the white blood cells to some extent. It would be, but more important, it would also pass the nutrients and some oxygen, some oxygen to the cells around. Why do we have the cerebrospinal fluid and not just a normal blood? Because we have the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is dividing, is a border between cerebrospinal fluid and the blood. You already know something about this, but it's important to get the idea. Yes, we want to have our brain extremely safe as possible. That's why our evolution, generally, why it is like that way, that we have a separate system for the central nervous system, the separate system of the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, and where it is produced? It is produced in the choroid plexus. Here, this is a name, choroid plexus. That is in the lateral ventricle. So these relatively big bodies of the fluid in the very center of the brain. So it is produced in this choroid plexus, and what happens next with them? Then it flows to the third ventricle. So from this it flows to the third ventricle. From the third ventricle through the aqueductus of Sylvius, you see this name here, it flows to the third ventricle. What happens then? From the third ventricle, it flows to the subarachnoid space. Yes, of the brain, but also of the spinal cord. And what then? Then, in the subarachnoid space, we have something called arachnoid villi. Arachnoid villi have their own blood vessels, so they are able to absorb fluid, including cerebrospinal fluid. And this is how it flows. Yes, so it flows from the lateral ventricles to subarachnoid space. So it's constantly produced in the lateral ventricles and flows. Why it's important to get the idea how it flows? It's important because if something bad happens, we are in trouble. For example, if there is some tumor that would press on the aqueductus of Sylvius or in any other place, it would stop the flow of the cerebrospinal fluid. But it would not stop the production of the cerebrospinal fluid. So it will lead to the situation that more and more of the water of the cerebrospinal fluid is generated and there is no space for it. And it would lead to severe problems. In case of children, it would lead to hydrocephalus. And it's very, very serious conditions. So having a correct flow of the cerebrospinal fluid is critical for us. Why it's also important? It's also important that we know that because of this blood-brain barrier, by getting the blood from the patient, we do not know exactly what is happening in the cerebrospinal fluid. For example, if there is some infection inside the brain, yes, in the cerebrospinal fluid, in the brain parenchyma, it may not show up well in the blood. Yes, it is not always particularly clear. It may be, but it does not have to be. So if we are thinking whether there are bacteria there, we do not know how to check it. We can check it by the something called lumbar puncture. Lumbar puncture is that we get to the vertebral column and we get a needle into the spine. Yes, In this way we are able to get the cerebrospinal fluid out and to test it. For example, whether there are some bacteria. But there are also a lot of other things. For example, whether there is some blood in the cerebrospinal fluid and things like that. And this will give us a lot of information about what is happening in the central nervous system. So the cerebrospinal fluid and its flow and maintaining its flow is critical for our organism and for our health. Thank you.